The dust swirled across the parched Wyoming earth as Yates O'Malley stared at the freshly dug grave, his face as hard as the iron hills that surrounded St. George. The minister's words hung in the air, but Yates hadn't heard a single one of them. The only thing he could hear was the echo of his brother's last breath and the haunting promise he'd made to a dying man. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the minister concluded, closing his Bible with a solemn thud. One by one, the townsfolk offered condolences, but Yates barely registered their presence. The year was 1878, and at 32 years of age, he'd buried more loved ones than most men twice his age. His parents to cholera when he was 16, his wife Emma to childbirth 3 years back, and now his only brother Thomas, gunned down by outlaws while defending a stagecoach. "Mr. O'Malley," Sheriff Cooper said, placing a weathered hand on Yates's shoulder. "I promise you we'll find the men who did this." Yates nodded, his blue eyes cold. "No need, Sheriff, I'll handle it myself." "That's not wise, son. The law," Yates scoffed, adjusting his worn Stetson. "The law didn't save my brother, your badges and your promises." "They're worth less than snake oil out here," the sheriff sighed, knowing better than to argue with a grieving man. "At least don't go alone." But Yates was already walking away, boots crunching on the dry ground. His faith in God, in justice, in humanity itself had died long before today. Now, all that remained was the promise of vengeance. As the crowd dispersed, Yates noticed a woman standing at a distance, her gaze fixed on him. She wasn't from St. George, he would have remembered her. In a town of barely 200 souls, newcomers stood out like wildflowers in winter. She approached slowly, her simple blue dress billowing in the breeze, a stark contrast to her fiery red hair partially concealed beneath a modest bonnet. Her green eyes held a compassion that made Yates immediately uncomfortable. "Mr. O'Malley," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'm Penelope Lawrence. I was on the stagecoach your brother saved." Yates studied her face, noticing the small cut above her left eyebrow and the bruise forming on her cheekbone. The attack had been just 3 days ago. "Miss Lawrence," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "I appreciate your coming, but I'm afraid I'm not much for conversation today." "I understand," she replied, her hands clutching a small leather-bound book that Yates immediately recognized as a Bible. "I just wanted to tell you that your brother died saving many lives, mine included. He was heroic." The word twisted in Yates like a knife. Heroic. What good was heroism if it left you 6 feet under? "Heroism is cold comfort for those left behind, Miss Lawrence," he said, his voice rough with emotion he refused to show. "I know," she said simply. "But I thought you should know he didn't suffer. She hesitated. "He asked me to pray with him at the end, and I did." Something snapped inside Yates. "Pray? You think prayer matters out here? Where was God when those outlaws opened fire? Where was he when my wife died in childbirth? Where was he every damned day of suffering in this God-forsaken territory?" His voice had risen, drawing stares from the few remaining mourners. Penelope didn't flinch. "I don't pretend to have those answers, Mr. O'Malley." "Well, I do," he said, his jaw tight. "There are no answers because there's no one listening. I don't pray, Miss Lawrence, not anymore." Instead of the offense or shock he expected, her face softened with understanding. "Then I'll do it for you." The simple declaration stopped him cold. No judgment, no sermon, just a quiet offer that somehow felt more genuine than all the hollow condolences he'd received that day. Before he could respond, Sheriff Cooper approached again. "Miss Lawrence, your coach to Cheyenne leaves in 20 minutes." She nodded to the sheriff before turning back to Yates. "I'm staying at my aunt's ranch just outside of town for the summer. Rose Hill, it's called, should you ever need anything." Yates watched her walk away, the dust settling in her wake. He had no intention of seeing Penelope Lawrence again. He had outlaws to hunt and vengeance to claim. Faith, prayers, compassion, these were luxuries he could no longer afford. As the cemetery emptied and the sun began its descent behind the mountains, Yates stood alone by his brother's grave. The fresh-turned earth was the same rich brown as Emma's hair had been. The same as their unborn child buried in the same ground 3 years prior. "I'll find them, Thomas," he promised, "and they'll pay for what they did." He mounted his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Copper, and rode toward town. The last light of day painted St. George in hues of gold and amber, a deceptively peaceful scene for a town that had seen its share of violence. Wyoming territory was still wild, despite the encroaching civilization from the east. The Double Eagle Saloon glowed with lamplight as Yates tied Copper to the hitching post outside. The familiar sounds of piano music, clinking glasses, and boisterous conversations greeted him as he pushed through the batwing doors. "Yates," called Samuel Rogers from behind the bar, his usually jovial face somber. "Whiskey's on the house tonight." Yates nodded, taking a seat at the bar. Samuel slid a glass and bottle toward him, then leaned in closer. "Heard talk that the Blackwell gang was responsible for the stage-coach robbery," Samuel said quietly. "4 men led by Elijah Blackwell. They've been hitting coaches between here and Laramie for months." Yates poured himself a generous portion of whiskey. "Any idea where they might be holed up?" Samuel glanced around, making sure nobody was listening too closely. "Word is they've got a hideout up in the Blackthorn Mountains north of here. Cave system, difficult to find unless you know what you're looking for." "I'll find it," Yates said, downing his drink in one swallow. "Yates," Samuel's voice lowered further, "these aren't just ordinary bandits. Blackwell's a former Union Army captain gone bad. He's cunning and his men are loyal. They've killed lawmen in 3 territories. I'm not a lawman," Yates replied, refilling his glass, "and I've got nothing to lose." "That's what worries me," Samuel said, wiping down the bar with a rag. "A man with nothing to lose is liable to lose everything." Yates didn't respond. He drank steadily but carefully, knowing he needed his wits about him. The saloon filled as the evening progressed, but he barely noticed the card games, the working girls, or the occasional disputes that Samuel efficiently settled. His mind was mapping the journey to the Blackthorn Mountains, cataloging supplies he'd need, weapons to bring. It would be at least a 3-day ride to reach the range, and then who knew how long to locate the gang's hideout. But time wasn't a concern. "Justice or vengeance, whatever you wanted to call it, was worth the wait. Mind if I join you?" A female voice interrupted his thoughts. Yates looked up to see a saloon girl with painted lips and tired eyes. "Not tonight, Rosie, thank you," she nodded, understanding in her expression. "Sorry about Thomas. He was a good man." "Yes, he was," Yates agreed, surprised at the sincerity in her voice. Even in a place like this, his brother had left an impression of decency. As the night wore on, the saloon gradually emptied. Yates paid his tab despite Samuel's protests and stepped out into the cool night air. The stars blazed overhead, indifferent to the struggles below. Once, he'd looked at those same stars and seen divine handiwork. Now they were just burning balls of gas, distant and cold. He untied Copper and led him down the main street toward his small ranch just outside of town. The horse's hoofbeats echoed in the quiet, a lonely percussion to his thoughts. His home was dark when he arrived, no lamps lit, no welcoming presence, just as it had been for 3 years now. The small cabin that had once felt full of promise now stood as a monument to everything he'd lost. Yates tended to Copper, unsaddling him and ensuring he had fresh water and feed. The routine tasks helped quiet his mind, if only temporarily. Inside, he lit a single lamp and sat heavily at the table, pulling paper and pencil toward him. He began making a list of supplies: ammunition, jerky, coffee, hardtack, enough for at least 2 weeks in the mountains. He'd leave at first light before most of the town was stirring. Less chance of the sheriff trying to stop him that way. As he prepared for bed, Yates's eyes fell on the chest at the foot of his bed. Emma's Bible was inside, untouched since her passing. For a moment, he considered opening it, seeking some comfort in the pages that had brought her such peace. But the moment passed and the bitterness returned. "I don't pray," he said aloud to the empty room, echoing his words to Penelope Lawrence. "Not anymore." But as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, Penelope's response followed him into his dreams. "Then I'll do it for you." And somehow, despite everything, that brought him the first moment of peace he'd felt in years. Dawn broke clear and cold over the Wyoming landscape. Yates had been up since before first light, packing supplies and checking his weapons. His Winchester rifle was cleaned and oiled, as was his Colt revolver. A hunting knife was strapped to his belt, and a smaller blade was tucked into his boot. He was securing the last of his provisions to Copper's saddle when the sound of an approaching horse made him turn. Sheriff Cooper rode up, looking like he'd been up all night. "Figured you'd try to slip away early," the sheriff said, dismounting with a grunt. At 55, Cooper was still spry, but the years of law enforcement in a frontier town had taken their toll. "Not slipping away, Sheriff. Just heading out. To the Blackthorns, I presume?" When Yates didn't answer, Cooper continued. "I can't stop you, Yates, but I can tell you this is a fool's errand. Blackwell and his gang will kill you before you get within 50 yards of their hideout." Yates tightened a strap on his saddlebag. "Maybe, but I have to try." "Your brother wouldn't want this," Cooper said, his voice gentler now. "Thomas believed in the law, and look where that got him." Yates swung into the saddle, looking down at the sheriff. "I'm not asking for your blessing, Cooper, just stay out of my way." The sheriff sighed, stepping back. "At least take this." He held out a folded piece of paper. "It's a map of the Blackthorns, as best as I could draw it, marked a few spots where travelers have reported being robbed. Might give you a starting point." Yates hesitated, then took the map, surprised by the gesture. "Thanks. And Yates," Cooper added as he turned to go, "if by some miracle you find them and stay alive, try to bring Blackwell back breathing. There are procedures, trials, that's how justice works." "Justice?" Yates repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. "We'll see." With a tip of his hat, he nudged Copper into motion and rode away from St. George, the rising sun at his back. The journey north was solitary and silent, just as Yates preferred it. The land gradually changed from open plains to rolling foothills, the vegetation growing thicker as he approached the mountains. By late afternoon, he'd reached the first true ascent into the Blackthorns, a rugged range named for the dark, twisted trees that dotted its slopes. He made camp in a small clearing beside a stream, building a fire small enough to cook his meal but not large enough to draw attention from a distance. As night fell, the sounds of the wilderness surrounded him: the call of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Yates spread Cooper's saddle blanket and sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap. Sleep would be light tonight, alert for any sound that didn't belong to the natural world. The Blackwell gang might not be the only danger in these mountains. Grizzlies, mountain lions, and the occasional hostile native still roamed these parts. As the fire burned down to embers, Yates found himself thinking of Penelope Lawrence. There had been something about her, a strength beneath her gentle exterior. He wondered about her story, how she'd come to be on that fateful stagecoach, what had brought her to Wyoming territory. "Not your concern," he muttered to himself. Getting involved with another person, caring about them, that was a road that led only to more pain. Better to remain alone, focused on the task at hand. Still, as exhaustion finally overtook him and he drifted into a fitful sleep, her words echoed in his mind. "Then I'll do it for you." A promise both simple and profound, the kind that could anchor a man adrift in a storm of grief and rage. The next morning dawned misty and cool, the higher elevation already showing its effects. Yates broke camp efficiently, leaving as little trace of his presence as possible. According to the sheriff's map, he was approaching the general area where most of the robberies had occurred. The terrain grew steadily more challenging. The trail narrowed, sometimes disappearing altogether, forcing Yates to rely on his own tracking skills and instincts. Copper was sure-footed and steady, but even he struggled on some of the steeper inclines. By midday, they'd reached a high plateau that offered a view of the surrounding mountains. Yates dismounted, giving Copper a rest while he studied the landscape through his field glasses. The sheriff's map had marked an X near a distinctive rock formation shaped like a sleeping bear. From his vantage point, Yates could see it about 2 miles to the northeast. He was about to mount up again when a glint of light caught his eye, sunlight reflecting off metal or glass. Someone was watching from the ridgeline above. Moving casually as if he hadn't noticed, Yates adjusted his hat and pretended to consult his map. With deliberate slowness, he led Copper behind a large boulder, then drew his rifle and waited. Minutes passed. Then, the soft sound of rock scraping against rock. Someone was moving along the ridge, trying to get a better angle. Yates remained motionless, his breathing controlled and steady. A figure emerged from behind an outcropping about 100 yards away. A man with a rifle, dressed in trail-worn clothing, his face obscured by a bandana. He wasn't being particularly careful now, apparently believing Yates had moved on. Yates raised his rifle, sighting down the barrel. One shot, and he could start eliminating Blackwell's gang one by one. His finger tightened on the trigger, but something stopped him. Not conscience, he'd long since made peace with what he was about to do. No, it was strategy. This man could lead him to the others, to Blackwell himself. Dead men told no tales. Lowering his rifle, Yates watched as the lookout scanned the area once more, then turned and disappeared back over the ridge. As soon as he was out of sight, Yates mounted Copper and began to follow, keeping a careful distance. The trail wound through a series of switchbacks, climbing higher into the mountains. Twice, Yates had to stop and dismount, leading Copper by the reins over particularly treacherous sections. All the while, he kept the lookout in sight, a distant figure moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. Late afternoon found them approaching a box canyon, the walls rising steep and sheer on 3 sides. The lookout disappeared around a bend in the trail. Yates tied Copper to a sturdy pine, whispering reassurances to the nervous horse, then continued on foot. Moving with the stealth of a mountain lion, Yates crept to the bend and peered around. The canyon opened up before him, and there, nestled against the far wall, was what appeared to be the entrance to a cave. Several horses were tethered nearby, and a thin wisp of smoke rose from what must be a carefully concealed campfire. Yates counted 4 horses, which matched Samuel's information about the gang's size. As he watched, the lookout approached the cave entrance and was greeted by another man who stepped out to meet him. They conversed briefly, then both disappeared inside. This was it. He'd found the Blackwell gang's hideout. Now came the difficult part, figuring out how to take on 4 armed men, likely all experienced killers, in terrain they knew intimately. Night was falling rapidly in the mountains. Yates retreated to where he'd left Copper, made a small, sheltered camp well off the trail, and considered his options. A frontal assault was suicide. Waiting for them to leave the canyon might take days, and there was no guarantee they'd all leave together. As he chewed on a piece of jerky, Yates realized he needed more information. How many men were actually in the cave? Was Blackwell among them? Were there lookouts posted that he hadn't spotted? He decided to risk a closer reconnaissance under cover of darkness. Checking his weapons one last time, Yates set out, moving carefully through the growing shadows back toward the canyon. The moon rose, 3/4 full, casting enough light to navigate by but also creating deep pools of shadow where a man could hide. Yates used these to his advantage, advancing slowly toward the cave entrance. As he drew closer, he could hear voices, men talking, laughing, the clink of bottles. They seemed relaxed, confident in their remote hideout. Through a gap in the rocks, Yates could see into the cave mouth. A fire burned inside, illuminating 4 men seated around it. One man stood out older than the others, with a neatly trimmed beard and the bearing of someone used to giving orders. This had to be Elijah Blackwell, the former Union captain. He was speaking, gesturing with a bottle in his hand. "Next coach comes through Rattlesnake Pass in 3 days, Blackwell was saying. "Wells Fargo shipment, according to our friend in Laramie. gold heading for the bank in Cheyenne. How much? Asked one of the others, a heavyset man with a scarred face. Enough to set us up proper, Blackwell replied. Maybe even enough to get out of this God-forsaken territory altogether. Head south to Mexico, live like kings. The men chuckled appreciatively at this prospect. Yates clenched his jaw, thinking of his brother dying to protect a stagecoach while these men planned their next robbery. What about that shooting business last week? Asked another gang member, this one younger with a shock of blonde hair. That messenger got a good look at Jeb before he went down. Blackwell waved dismissively. One lawman with a description of Jeb's ugly face ain't gonna find us up here. Besides, we'll be long gone after this next job. Shoulda just killed everyone on that coach, muttered the fourth man, presumably Jeb. No witnesses that way. And bring the U.S. Marshals down on our heads, Blackwell snapped. Use your brain, Jeb. We take the money, not lives, unless we have to. He took a long pull from his bottle. Though I gotta admit, that red-headed woman on the coach was mighty pretty. Almost ashamed to let her go. A cold fury washed over Yates. They were talking about Penelope, about the attack that had claimed his brother's life. Blackwell might claim they didn't take lives unnecessarily, but Thomas was just as dead. And now they were planning another robbery, another opportunity for innocent people to die. He'd heard enough. Yates began to back away, mind racing with plans. 3 days until the next robbery. That was his window to act. He could ride to the nearest telegraph office, alert the authorities, have deputies and marshals waiting at Rattlesnake Pass. But even as the thought formed, he rejected it. This was personal. Thomas had died protecting others from these men. The reckoning would be personal too. Yates had almost made it back to the tree line when his boot dislodged a small stone. It clattered down the slope, the sound impossibly loud in the night stillness. Instantly, the voices in the cave went quiet. What was that? Someone demanded. Probably just a mountain lion, came Blackwell's reply, but Yates could hear the suspicion in his voice. Jeb, Carter, check it out. Yates flattened himself against the canyon wall, melting into the shadows as 2 figures emerged from the cave, guns drawn. They moved cautiously, scanning the area. See anything? Called the one named Carter. Nah, Jeb replied. But something don't feel right. They began moving in Yates's direction, separating to cover more ground. One was coming directly toward his hiding place. In seconds, he'd be discovered. Making a split-second decision, Yates picked up another rock and threw it as far as he could in the opposite direction. It landed with a satisfying clatter on the far side of the canyon. There, Jeb shouted, both men turning toward the sound. Yates used the distraction to slip further back into the shadows, moving swiftly but silently away from the cave. He'd almost made it to safety when a shout rang out. Someone's been here. Tracks in the dirt. Gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off rocks around him. Yates broke into a run, zigzagging to avoid presenting an easy target. More shots followed, but the darkness and terrain worked in his favor. By the time he reached Copper, the sounds of pursuit had faded. Still, he couldn't risk staying where he was. Quickly gathering his meager camp, Yates mounted Copper and rode deeper into the mountains, away from the canyon. He pushed on for several hours, despite the dangerous conditions, determined to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Blackwell gang. Eventually, exhaustion forced him to stop. He found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang, deep in a forest of pines. As he settled in for what remained of the night, Yates knew his element of surprise was gone. The gang would be on high alert now, possibly even abandon their hideout altogether. But they wouldn't cancel the robbery. The prospect of a Wells Fargo gold shipment was too tempting. They'd stick to their plan, which meant they'd be at Rattlesnake Pass in 3 days, and so would Yates. Dawn broke with a heavy mist clinging to the mountainside. Yates was already awake, having slept fitfully at best. His mind had been working through the night, formulating and discarding plans for Rattlesnake Pass. The pass was notorious for ambushes, a narrow trail winding between steep cliffs, with limited visibility and few escape routes. The perfect spot for a robbery and equally perfect for Yates's purposes. He spent the day scouting the area around the pass, familiarizing himself with every rock and tree, every potential hiding spot or vantage point. By evening, he had a clear picture of how the ambush would unfold both the gang's and his own. As darkness fell again, Yates made camp several miles from the pass, in a secluded glade beside a small stream. He cleaned his weapons meticulously, checked his ammunition, and allowed himself a slightly larger fire than usual. Tomorrow would be the last day of preparation. The day after, the stagecoach would come through, and with it, the Blackwell gang. As he sat by the fire, the events of the past few days weighing heavily on him, Yates found himself thinking once again of Penelope Lawrence. Her calm courage in the face of his anger, her simple offer to pray for him when he could not or would not pray for himself. What would she think of what he was planning? Would she understand his need for vengeance, or would she counsel forgiveness, as her Bible undoubtedly taught? Doesn't matter, he muttered, stoking the fire with a stick. She's not here. But somehow, in the dancing flames and the whispering pines, he could almost hear her voice. Then I'll do it for you. And for a moment, the crushing weight of his grief and rage seemed to lighten just a fraction. Yates shook his head, dismissing the fancy. Prayers wouldn't bring Thomas back. Prayers wouldn't stop Blackwell and his gang from killing again. Only lead and determination would do that. Yet as he rolled himself in his blanket and drifted towards sleep, a different thought intruded. What if, after this was over, he rode to Rose Hill Ranch? What if he told Penelope that her prayers hadn't worked, that vengeance had been the only answer after all? But even as he imagined the scene, he knew he wouldn't go. Because what frightened him most wasn't the possibility that she might condemn his actions. It was the possibility that she wouldn't, that she might look at him with those compassionate green eyes and offer understanding he didn't deserve. Morning came with a light rain, unusual for this time of year, but not unwelcome. Yates broke camp early and rode to Rattlesnake Pass, arriving before the sun had fully cleared the eastern peaks. The rain had stopped, but the clouds remained, casting a gray pall over the landscape. He spent the day finalizing his preparations. At the narrowest point of the pass, he found a ledge overlooking the trail, well concealed by a stand of pines. From here, he had clear sightlines in both directions. This would be his position when the stagecoach came through. About 100 yards further along the trail, where it made a sharp turn around a massive boulder, was the most likely spot for the gang's ambush. Yates studied it carefully, noting potential hiding places and escape routes. His plan was simple but risky. Let the gang stop the coach, then catch them by surprise from his elevated position. With his reconnaissance complete, Yates returned to his camp to rest and prepare for the coming confrontation. Tomorrow would decide everything. The night passed slowly, sleep coming in brief, troubled intervals. Each time Yates closed his eyes, he saw Thomas falling, heard the echo of gunfire, felt the cold certainty of what he must do. Dawn broke clear and bright, the previous day's clouds swept away by a brisk mountain wind. Yates rose, ate a sparse breakfast, and methodically checked his weapons one final time. Then he mounted Copper and rode to Rattlesnake Pass. He positioned himself on the ledge he'd selected, tethering Copper well back among the trees where the horse wouldn't be seen or heard. From his vantage point, Yates could see the entire stretch of trail through the pass. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The stagecoach was scheduled to come through around midday. Yates remained vigilant, watching for any sign of the Blackwell gang taking up their positions. Around 11 o'clock, he spotted movement on the opposite side of the pass. 2 riders approaching cautiously, keeping to the tree line. Even at this distance, Yates recognized Jeb and the heavy-set man from the cave. They dismounted near the boulder where Yates had predicted the ambush would occur and led their horses into the cover of the trees. 20 minutes later, Blackwell himself appeared, accompanied by the fourth gang member, the young blonde man. They too concealed themselves near the boulder. The trap was set. Yates checked his rifle one last time, his breathing slow and controlled. This was it. After today, Thomas would be avenged, and perhaps Yates could find some measure of peace. Just before noon, the distant sound of hoofbeats and rattling wheels echoed through the pass. The stagecoach was coming. Yates shifted position slightly, ensuring he had clear shots at all four gang members' hiding spots. The coach appeared around the bend, moving at a good clip, a team of 6 horses pulling it along the rugged trail. From his position, Yates could see the driver and a shotgun messenger on the box. How many passengers were inside he couldn't tell. As the coach approached the boulder, a shout rang out. "Hold it right there." Blackwell stepped onto the trail, rifle raised, bandana covering the lower half of his face. The other 3 gang members emerged from their hiding places, surrounding the coach. The driver pulled back hard on the reins, bringing the team to a stop. The shotgun messenger reached for his weapon but froze when he saw 4 rifles aimed at him. "Easy now," Blackwell called. "Nobody needs to die today. Just toss down the strongbox and you can be on your way." The driver and messenger exchanged glances. Then, slowly, the messenger set aside his shotgun and nodded to the driver, who climbed down to retrieve the strongbox from beneath the seat. Yates raised his rifle, sighting on Blackwell. 1 shot, and the leader would fall. The others would be momentarily confused, giving him time to take down at least 1 more before they realized where the shots were coming from. His finger tightened on the trigger. And then the stagecoach door opened. A woman stepped out, ignoring the driver's frantic gestures to stay inside. She wore a simple blue traveling dress and a small hat that couldn't quite contain her red hair. Penelope Lawrence. Yates froze, his shot forgotten as shock coursed through him. What was she doing here? She was supposed to be safe at Rose Hill Ranch, not walking into the middle of a robbery and his ambush. "Madam, get back in the coach," the driver shouted, but Penelope stood her ground, facing Blackwell directly. "I know who you are," she said, her voice carrying clearly to Yates's position. "You're the men who attacked the coach from St. George 3 weeks ago, the ones who killed Thomas O'Malley." Blackwell laughed, though there was an edge of unease to it. "Don't know what you're talking about, lady." "Now get back in the coach before someone gets hurt." "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Penelope continued, taking a step forward. "And I know something else too. Yates O'Malley is coming for you. He might even be watching right now." Yates felt his blood run cold. What was she doing? Was she deliberately putting herself in danger? Or did she somehow know he was there? The gang members glanced nervously at the surrounding cliffs and trees. Jeb raised his rifle, scanning the area. "Boss, maybe we should just grab the gold and go. Something don't feel right." Blackwell hesitated, clearly unsettled by Penelope's words. "Lady, you're either brave or crazy. Either way, you're testing my patience." "I'm neither," Penelope replied calmly. "I'm just someone who believes that violence only begets more violence. That revenge is a poison that kills the one who drinks it." She was looking directly at the boulder behind which Yates was concealed, as if she could see through rock and tree, straight to his hiding place, straight to his soul. "The law will find you eventually," she continued. "But it doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You can surrender now, face justice properly." Blackwell laughed again, this time with genuine amusement. "Lady, I don't know what kind of fairy tale world you live in, but this is Wyoming territory. Justice comes from the barrel of a gun out here." "Not always," Penelope said. "Sometimes it comes from making different choices than the ones that brought us here." Yates realized with growing alarm what she was trying to do. She was attempting to prevent a shootout to save not just the people on the coach, but him as well. And possibly even the gang members. But she was putting herself directly in harm's way to do it. Blackwell seemed to reach the end of his patience. "Enough talking. Jeb Carter, get the strongbox. You," he pointed at Penelope, "get back in the coach before I forget my rule about not hurting women." Jeb approached the driver who had set the strongbox on the ground. Carter kept his rifle trained on the shotgun messenger. The blonde gang member watched the tree line, still nervous. "Please," Penelope said, her voice softer now. "There's been enough death already." Something in her tone must have struck a chord with Blackwell. He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly lowered his bandana, revealing his face. "You were on that coach," he said, recognition dawning. "The one where that messenger got killed," Penelope nodded. "I was. And I saw the regret in your eyes when your man shot him. You didn't want that to happen." Blackwell's expression hardened. "You don't know anything about me, lady." "I know you were Captain Elijah Blackwell, Union Army, decorated for bravery at Gettysburg," Penelope replied. "I know you had a wife and daughter in Virginia who died of typhoid while you were fighting. I know you came west to escape your grief, only to find that it followed you." Blackwell looked genuinely shaken. "How could you possibly? My father was a chaplain in the Union Army," Penelope explained. "He knew you, spoke highly of you. He'd be heartbroken to see what you've become." The pass fell silent, the only sound the nervous shifting of the coach horses. Even Jeb and Carter had paused, the strongbox momentarily forgotten as they watched this unexpected confrontation. Yates remained frozen in place, rifle still raised but his finger now off the trigger. What was happening here was beyond anything he'd anticipated. "Your father," Blackwell said slowly. "Chaplain Lawrence, from the 14th Connecticut," Penelope nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "He never forgot the brave men he served with, including you." Blackwell looked away, something like shame crossing his weathered features. For a moment, Yates could see the man he must have been before grief and bitterness transformed him, not so different, perhaps, from what Yates himself was becoming. The moment stretched, taut with possibility. Then Blackwell's expression hardened again. "Nice try, miss. But sob stories don't change facts. We're taking that gold," he gestured to Jeb. "Get the box." Jeb bent to lift the strong box. As he did, his eyes widened at something he saw on the trail beyond the coach. "Boss," he shouted. "Riders coming," Blackwell whirled, raising his rifle. In the distance, at the far end of the pass, a group of mounted men was approaching at a gallop. Even from here, the glint of badges was visible on their chests. "Sheriff's posse," Carter yelled. "We're trapped," chaos erupted, the gang scattered, racing for their horses. The shotgun messenger grabbed his weapon, firing a warning shot that sent the coach horses into a panic. The driver struggled to control the team as the coach lurched forward, and Penelope, caught in the middle of it all, was thrown to the ground as the coach nearly ran her over. Without thinking, Yates fired his rifle, the shot striking the ground near Blackwell's feet, stopping him in his tracks. Blackwell looked up, spotting Yates on the ledge. "O'Malley," he shouted, recognition in his voice. He raised his rifle, but another shot from Yates sent him diving for cover. The posse was closing in rapidly from one end of the pass. The gang's only escape route was past the coach, toward the other end and directly in Yates's line of fire. "Jeb, Carter, this way." Blackwell ordered, gesturing toward a narrow trail leading up the side of the pass, a trail that would bring them dangerously close to Yates's position. Yates had seconds to decide. He could easily pick off at least two of the gang as they climbed the trail. But Penelope was still on the ground, dazed from her fall, and the coach driver was struggling to regain control of the panicking team. If a gunfight erupted now, she'd be caught in the crossfire. Cursing under his breath, Yates made his choice. He scrambled down from his ledge, sliding and jumping to reach the trail. As soon as his feet hit level ground, he ran toward Penelope, keeping his rifle ready. "Stay down," he shouted to her as bullets began to fly. The posse had reached the coach and was exchanging fire with the gang members, who had taken cover behind rocks along the trail. Penelope looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of him. "Yates." "What are you?" "Not now," he cut her off, reaching her side and pulling her behind the relative safety of a large boulder. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though he could see a nasty scrape on her cheek where she'd hit the ground. "The people in the coach. The posse has them covered," Yates assured her, risking a glance around the boulder. The coach was now stopped about 50 yards away, the passengers huddled inside as the lawmen used it for cover while they fired at the gang. Blackwell and his men were pinned down, caught between the posse and the steep walls of the pass. Their only escape route was the narrow trail they'd been heading for, the trail that led past Yates's position. "Stay here," Yates told Penelope firmly. "Don't move until this is over." Before she could protest, he was gone, circling behind the boulder to reach a position where he could intercept the gang if they made a break for the trail. He didn't have to wait long. With a shout, Blackwell and his 3 men suddenly made a desperate dash from their cover, firing wildly at the posse to keep the lawmen's heads down. They were heading straight for the trail, exactly as Yates had predicted. He stepped out from behind a pine tree, rifle raised. "That's far enough, Blackwell," the gang skidded to a halt, caught by surprise. For a heartbeat, no one moved, then Jeb, the fastest draw, went for his gun. Yates fired without hesitation, the shot catching Jeb in the shoulder and spinning him to the ground. Carter raised his rifle but froze when Yates smoothly worked the lever action, chambering another round and aiming at his chest. "Next one won't be a shoulder," Yates warned, his voice cold. Blackwell slowly raised his hands, his eyes never leaving Yates's face. "You're Thomas's brother," he said, not a question but a statement. "The one she warned us about." "That's right," Yates confirmed. "The one who's been tracking you since you put a bullet in my brother." The young blonde gang member looked nervously between Blackwell and Yates, clearly unsure what to do. The posse was approaching cautiously from behind, having heard the shot and seen the confrontation. "It wasn't supposed to happen that way," Blackwell said, his voice low. "We don't kill unless we have to. Your brother." He drew on Jeb, it was reflex. "Save it," Yates said, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I didn't come all this way for excuses." He had Blackwell dead to rights. One squeeze of the trigger and Thomas would be avenged. Justice or vengeance would be served. "Yates." Penelope's voice came from behind him. Despite his instructions she'd followed, "Please don't." "Stay back, Miss Lawrence," Yates said without taking his eyes off Blackwell. "This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does," she replied, moving slowly into his peripheral vision. "It concerns all of us. What happens here will change you forever, one way or another." The posse had reached them now, rifles trained on the gang members. Sheriff Cooper was at their lead, his weathered face grim but relieved. "Yates," he called, "we've got them. It's over. Let the law handle it from here." Yates didn't lower his rifle. "The law," he repeated bitterly. "Where was the law when Thomas was dying on that trail?" "I was coming as fast as I could," Cooper replied honestly. "Sometimes the law is too slow, too far away. But that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. That doesn't mean we stop believing in it." Blackwell watched this exchange with a curious expression, almost resigned, yet strangely alert, as if he were witnessing something important. "He's right," Penelope said softly. "Killing him won't bring Thomas back. It won't ease your pain. It will only add to it." "You don't know that," Yates argued, but there was less conviction in his voice. "Yes, I do," she said simply. "Because I've seen what vengeance does to good men. It hollows them out, leaves nothing but an empty shell where their soul used to be." She gestured toward Blackwell. "Just like him." Blackwell's eyes widened slightly at her words, then dropped to the ground, unable to meet her gaze. For what seemed like an eternity, no one moved. The mountain breeze rustled through the pines. A hawk screamed somewhere overhead. The world held its breath. Then, slowly, Yates lowered his rifle. "Take them," he said to Sheriff Cooper, his voice rough with emotion. "Make sure they stand trial for what they did." Relief washed over Cooper's face. "You have my word." He gestured to his deputies, who moved forward to disarm and secure the gang members. As Blackwell was led past him, the outlaw paused. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I am sorry about your brother. He died protecting others." "That's more than most of us can say." Yates said nothing, watching as the man who had haunted his thoughts for weeks was led away in handcuffs. The emptiness he'd expected to feel at this moment of victory was absent. Instead, there was only a profound weariness and perhaps, though he hardly dared acknowledge it, the first fragile tendrils of relief. Penelope stood beside him, her presence a silent support. When the posse and their prisoners were gone, escorting the stage-coach safely through the remainder of the pass, she finally spoke. "Are you all right?" Yates looked at her, really looked at her for perhaps the first time. The scrape on her cheek was beginning to bruise. Her dress was torn and dirty from her fall, yet there was a strength in her that went beyond physical appearance, a certainty of purpose that he found both compelling and somewhat intimidating. "I don't know," he answered truthfully. "I've been focused on finding them for so long. I'm not sure what comes next." "That's all right," she said with a small smile. "You don't have to know yet." They stood in silence for a moment, the aftermath of violence gradually giving way to an unexpected calm. "You knew I'd be here," Yates said finally. "How?" Penelope brushed a strand of red hair from her face. "I didn't know for certain, but when I heard about the Wells Fargo shipment, I remembered what Samuel at the Double Eagle told me about you asking questions. It wasn't hard to put together." "You deliberately put yourself in danger," Yates said, a hint of accusation in his tone. "You could have been killed." "I knew you wouldn't let that happen," she replied simply. Her faith in him was both baffling and humbling. "How could you possibly know that? You barely know me." "I know enough," she said. "I know you're a good man who's lost his way. I know grief and anger can make us act against our true nature. And I know that sometimes all it takes is someone to remind us of who we really are." Yates had no response to that. The certainty with which she spoke was disarming. "Why did you do it?" he asked instead. "Put yourself at risk for me, for them." Penelope looked out across the pass to where the posse and stagecoach had disappeared around the bend. "Because every soul is worth saving. Even those who think they're beyond redemption." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Yates found himself wanting to believe them, even as the hardened part of his heart resisted. "I should get back to town," he said finally, changing the subject. "Cooper will want my statement about what happened," Penelope nodded. "And I should continue to Cheyenne. My aunt is expecting me." An awkward silence fell. There seemed to be more to say, yet neither could find the right words. "Well," Yates said at last, extending his hand formally. "Thank you, Miss Lawrence, for everything." She took his hand, but instead of shaking it, she held it firmly in both of hers. "The offer still stands, you know, if you ever need anything. Rose Hill Ranch isn't far from St. George." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an understanding, a possibility. Then she released his hand and stepped back. "Goodbye, Mr. O'Malley. Goodbye, Miss Lawrence." She turned and walked toward the stage-coach trail, where one of the posse members had remained behind to escort her safely to the next station. Yates watched her go, an unfamiliar feeling stirring in his chest. It was only when she disappeared around the bend that he realized what it was. Hope. Faint and fragile, but unmistakably there. Hope that perhaps there was something beyond vengeance and grief. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his brother's death hadn't marked the end of everything worth living for. Yates retrieved Copper from where he'd left him tethered and began the long ride back to St. George, his mind full of red hair and green eyes, and words that refused to be forgotten. "I don't pray. Then I'll do it for you." 2 months passed, bringing summer to its full glory in Wyoming territory. St. George bustled with activity as the cattle drives came through, temporary cowhands spending their hard-earned pay in the saloons and shops. Yates sat on the porch of his small ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. The trial of Elijah Blackwell and his gang had concluded the previous week in Cheyenne. All 4 men had been convicted. Blackwell and 2 of his men sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison, while the youngest member, barely 19, had received 5 years after testifying against the others. Justice had been served, though not in the way Yates had originally envisioned. Yet he found himself at peace with the outcome, more or less. Thomas was still gone, but his killers would pay for their crimes within the bounds of the law. Life had gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy. Yates tended his small herd of cattle, helped neighbors when needed, and slowly began to engage with the community again. He'd even attended church last Sunday, sitting in the back pew, uncomfortable but present. Sheriff Cooper had offered him a deputy position, which Yates had politely declined. He wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility yet. Maybe someday, but not now. The one thing he hadn't done was ride out to Rose Hill Ranch, though he'd thought about it more often than he cared to admit. Penelope's face appeared in his dreams, her voice echoing in his mind during quiet moments. "Then I'll do it for you." He'd written a letter 3 weeks ago, an awkward, halting attempt to express his gratitude and perhaps something more. But the words had seemed inadequate on paper, and he'd never sent it. As the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, Yates rose from his chair, about to head inside for the night. Then he paused, hearing the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching. He tensed instinctively, hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Old habits died hard. But as the rider came into view, illuminated by the rising moon, he relaxed. Sheriff Cooper pulled his horse to a stop in front of the porch. "Evening, Yates." "Sheriff," Yates nodded. "Kind of late for a social call." Cooper dismounted with a grunt. "Not social exactly, got something for you." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an envelope. "Came in on today's mail coach from Cheyenne." Yates took the envelope, immediately recognizing the neat, flowing handwriting that addressed it to him. His heart beat a little faster. "Thought it might be important," Cooper said, a knowing glint in his eye. "Figured I'd deliver it personally." "Thank you," Yates said, turning the envelope over in his hands. Cooper remounted his horse. "Well, I'll leave you to it. Good night, Yates." "Good night, Sheriff." Once Cooper had ridden away, Yates went inside and lit a lamp. Sitting at his small kitchen table, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Mr. O'Malley, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been following the news of the trial from Cheyenne and was relieved to hear of its conclusion. Justice has been served, though I know that brings only cold comfort for your loss. My stay with my aunt at Rose Hill has been extended through the autumn. The Wyoming summer is beautiful, though quite different from my native Pennsylvania. I find I've grown fond of the open spaces and big skies. Perhaps the West is working its way into my heart more than I expected. I hope you don't mind my writing to you. After our last meeting, I felt there was more to say, yet neither of us seemed able to find the words. Perhaps paper and ink will serve where spoken words failed. I think often of our conversation in the cemetery and later at Rattlesnake Pass. You said you don't pray, and I said I would do it for you. I want you to know that I have kept that promise. Every night, I pray for your healing, for your peace, for your journey forward. But I've come to realize something, Mr. O'Malley. Prayers, while powerful, are sometimes better when accompanied by action. Faith without works, as the Bible says, is dead, so I'm extending an invitation. Rose Hill Ranch is hosting a harvest celebration on the last Saturday of this month. Nothing elaborate, just good food, some music, and friendly company. My aunt has heard me speak of you and insists that I extend the invitation. I would be honored if you would consider attending. If you choose not to come, I will understand. There is no obligation. But know that regardless of your decision, my prayers continue, as does my belief in the good man I glimpsed beneath the grief and anger. With sincere regards, Penelope Lawrence P.S. I've enclosed directions to Rose Hill should you need them. Yates read the letter twice more, something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. He set it down carefully on the table and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled Wyoming night. The last Saturday of the month was just 2 weeks away. Plenty of time to decide. Plenty of time to find excuses not to go. Plenty of time to continue hiding in his solitude. Yet even as these thoughts crossed his mind, Yates knew what his decision would be. He'd known it from the moment he'd recognized her handwriting on the envelope. 2 weeks later, Yates stood before his small mirror, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. He'd bought a new shirt in town yesterday and had his good suit pressed by Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress who'd clucked and fussed over him like a mother hen when he'd told her where he was going. Word traveled fast in St. George. By sundown, half the town knew that Yates O'Malley was attending a social gathering at Rose Hill Ranch, and more significantly, that he was going specifically to see Miss Penelope Lawrence. The knowing smiles and good-natured teasing had been both embarrassing and oddly heartening. Giving up on the tie, which refused to sit straight no matter how he adjusted it, Yates checked the time. The ride to Rose Hill would take about an hour. The celebration began at 4 o'clock according to Penelope's directions. If he left now, he'd arrive fashionably late, but not rudely so. Copper was freshly groomed and saddled, seemingly aware that this was no ordinary ride. Yates mounted up, took a deep breath, and set out. The day was perfect clear blue skies, a gentle breeze, temperatures mild for late summer. The landscape was beginning to show hints of the coming autumn, the green of the plains taking on a golden hue in places. As he rode, Yates found himself rehearsing what he might say when he saw her. "Hello, Miss Lawrence, thank you for your invitation," too formal. "Penelope, you look beautiful today," too forward. "I got your letter and, well, here I am," too awkward. By the time Rose Hill Ranch came into view, he'd given up on planning his words altogether. Better to trust the moment than try to script it. The ranch was larger than he'd expected, a sprawling main house built of stone and timber, several well-maintained outbuildings, and extensive corrals where fine horses grazed. A wooden arch over the entrance road had Rose Hill carved into it, the letters twined with carved roses. As Yates approached, he could see that the celebration was well underway. Tables had been set up in the yard between the main house and the largest barn, laden with food and drink. A small group of musicians played on a makeshift stage, while couples danced on a wooden platform constructed for the occasion. Children ran and played, their laughter carrying on the breeze. For a moment, Yates hesitated. This scene of normal, happy life seemed to belong to a different world than the one he'd been living in. Could he really step into it, even for an afternoon? Before he could reconsider, a young, stable hand approached. "Can I take your horse, sir?" Yates dismounted, handing over Copper's reins. "Thank you. Treat him well, he's particular about his ears." The boy nodded, leading Copper toward the stables. Yates smoothed his jacket, adjusted his hat, and walked toward the gathering. He'd only taken a few steps when he saw her. Penelope stood near the refreshment table, engaged in conversation with an older woman who bore enough resemblance to be her aunt. She wore a simple but elegant dress of deep green that complemented her red hair, which was styled more elaborately than he'd seen before. As if sensing his presence, she looked up. Their eyes met across the yard and her conversation faltered. Then a smile bloomed on her face, genuine, warm, and welcoming. Excusing herself from her aunt, Penelope made her way toward him, weaving through the guests with practiced grace. "Mr. O'Malley," she said when she reached him, her voice carrying the same warmth as her smile. "You came." "Yates," he corrected gently, "and yes, I received your invitation and—" He paused, the rehearsed words forgotten. "I wanted to see you again." The directness of his statement seemed to surprise her, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I'm glad, very glad." She gestured to the celebration around them. "This is my aunt's annual harvest gathering. Most of the county seems to attend." "It's quite something," Yates admitted, looking around at the festive scene. "I haven't been to anything like this in, well, a long time." "Then we'll have to make sure it's memorable," Penelope said, offering her arm. "May I introduce you to my aunt? She's been quite curious about the man I've mentioned so often." Yates felt a flutter of both nervousness and pleasure at the idea that Penelope had spoken of him frequently. He offered his arm in return. "I'd be honored." The afternoon passed in a pleasant blur. Mrs. Eleanor Lawrence, Penelope's aunt, proved to be a gracious hostess with a sharp wit that immediately put Yates at ease. The other guests, while curious about the newcomer, were welcoming and unpretentious ranchers, merchants, and townsfolk from the surrounding area. Yates found himself drawn into conversations about cattle prices, weather predictions, and local politics. To his surprise, he enjoyed it. The simple human connection, so long avoided, now felt like water to a man who hadn't realized how thirsty he'd been. Through it all, Penelope was never far from his side. Not hovering, but present, introducing him to people she thought he might get along with, refreshing his drink when needed, occasionally catching his eye across the gathering with a smile that seemed meant only for him. As evening approached, lanterns were lit around the yard, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. The music shifted to slower, more romantic tunes and couples took to the dance floor. Yates watched for a while, content to observe. Then, gathering his courage, he approached Penelope where she stood chatting with a group of young women. "Miss Lawrence," he said, tipping his hat slightly, "would you do me the honor of a dance?" The young women exchanged knowing glances as Penelope turned to him, surprise and pleasure evident in her expression. "I would be delighted, Mr. O'Malley," she replied, taking his offered hand. As they moved onto the dance floor, Yates felt a moment of panic. It had been years since he'd danced with a woman, not since Emma. But as he took Penelope in his arms, one hand at her waist, the other holding hers, the steps came back to him naturally. "I should warn you," he said as they began to move with the music, "I'm a bit out of practice." "You're doing wonderfully," she assured him, following his lead with easy grace. "Though I admit, I didn't expect you to ask me to dance." "Neither did I," he confessed. "But it seemed a shame to let the evening pass without at least one dance with the most beautiful woman here." Penelope's eyes widened slightly at the compliment, and that charming blush returned to her cheeks. "Mr. O'Malley Yates, I believe you're flirting with me." "I'm trying to," he admitted with a small smile. "It's been a while since I've done that too." She laughed, the sound warming him more than any summer sun. "Well, you're better at it than you think." They danced in comfortable silence for a while, the music wrapping around them like a gentle embrace. Other couples swirled nearby, but Yates was aware only of Penelope, the lightness of her hand in his, the subtle scent of roses that seemed to emanate from her hair, the way her eyes reflected the lantern light. "Thank you for inviting me," he said finally, his voice low. "I didn't realize how much I needed this, not just the celebration, but—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "The reminder that there's still good in the world, still joy to be found." Penelope's expression softened. "There's always joy to be found, Yates. Sometimes we just need help seeing it." As the music drew to a close, they remained standing close together, reluctant to break the moment. Around them, other couples were separating, some heading for refreshments, others returning to conversations. "Would you like to take a walk?" Penelope asked suddenly. "The gardens behind the house are lovely this time of year, especially in the evening light." Yates nodded, grateful for the suggestion. The crowd, while pleasant, was beginning to feel overwhelming after so long in solitude. Penelope led him along a stone path that wound around the main house to a garden that indeed deserved to be called lovely. Roses of various colors bloomed alongside other late summer flowers, their fragrance filling the air. Stone benches were placed strategically throughout, and a small fountain burbled peacefully at the center. "My aunt's pride and joy," Penelope explained as they walked. "Uncle James had it built for her on their 10th anniversary. She's maintained it herself since his passing 5 years ago." "It's beautiful," Yates said sincerely. "Peaceful." They found a bench partially secluded by a trellis of climbing roses and sat down. The sounds of the celebration were muted here, the music a distant melody carried on the evening breeze. "I followed the trial," Penelope said after a moment of comfortable silence. "Of Blackwell and his men," Yates nodded. "Cooper kept me informed. Justice was served, I suppose. How do you feel about it?" she asked, turning slightly to face him. "Truly." It was a probing question, but he found he didn't mind. With Penelope, honesty seemed not just expected, but somehow easier than with anyone else. At first I thought I'd feel, I don't know, satisfied, vindicated, but mostly I just felt tired. He looked down at his hands, then back at her. And relieved. Relieved that I didn't become what I was hunting. Penelope reached out, covering his hand with hers. That's why I was so afraid for you that day at Rattlesnake Pass. Not that you might be hurt physically, but that you might cross a line you couldn't uncross. You saved me from that, Yates said quietly. I'm not sure I ever properly thanked you. You didn't need to, she replied. Seeing you here today, beginning to live again, that's thanks enough. The simple sincerity of her words touched him deeply. In that moment, looking into her eyes, Yates felt something he'd thought long dead stir within him, the capacity for more than just survival, for more than just getting through each day. The capacity for hope, for connection, for love. The realization should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, arduous journey. Penelope, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't know what the future holds. I'm still finding my way back, but I'd like to see you again, not just at gatherings like this, but properly, if you'd be willing. Her smile was like the sunrise, gradual and glorious. I'd like that very much, Yates. Impulsively, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Then that's where we'll start. The remainder of the evening passed in quiet conversation. They rejoined the celebration for a time, shared another dance, and said their goodbyes as the gathering began to wind down. As Yates prepared to leave, Penelope walked with him to where the stable boy had brought Copper. When will I see you again? She asked, no pretense in her directness. How about Sunday? Yates suggested. After church, I could call on you here, perhaps take you for a ride if the weather's fine. Her eyes lit up at his mention of church. You've been attending, last 2 Sundays, he admitted. I sit in the back, still not entirely comfortable, but I'm trying. That means a great deal to me, she said softly. And yes, Sunday would be perfect. Yates mounted Copper, looking down at her in the fading light. Until Sunday then. Until Sunday, she echoed. Ride safely, Yates. As he rode away, Yates glanced back to see her still standing where he'd left her, a silhouette against the lantern-lit ranch. Something swelled in his chest, an emotion too new and fragile to name, yet strong enough to carry him through the miles home with a lightness he hadn't felt in years. The days until Sunday passed both too quickly and too slowly. Yates found himself anticipating their meeting with an eagerness that reminded him of his younger self, before loss and grief had hardened him. On Sunday morning, he dressed with particular care for church, arriving early enough to find a seat in the middle of the congregation rather than his usual place at the back. He noticed the surprised but pleased glances from townsfolk who had grown accustomed to his isolation. The service itself was simple but meaningful. The minister, Reverend Wilson, spoke about renewal and second chances, themes that resonated deeply with Yates in his current state of mind. When the Reverend led the congregation in prayer, Yates bowed his head along with the others. But instead of merely going through the motions, he found himself forming his own silent words, not quite a prayer, perhaps, more of an acknowledgement. An admission that perhaps he'd been wrong to close himself off so completely from the possibility of faith. That maybe, just maybe, there was something beyond the physical world, something that had sent a red-haired angel to pull him back from the brink of his own darkness. After the service, he rode directly to Rose Hill Ranch, a small bouquet of wildflowers gathered along the way secured carefully in his saddlebag. Penelope was waiting for him on the front porch, dressed in a riding outfit of deep blue that highlighted her slender figure. Right on time, she greeted him with a smile as he dismounted. Aunt Alina insisted I take a picnic lunch for us. I hope you're hungry. Famished, Yates replied, retrieving the flowers from his saddlebag. These are for you, nothing fancy, just some wildflowers I spotted on the ride over. Penelope's face lit up as she accepted them. They're beautiful, thank you. She inhaled their scent, then looked up at him with warmth in her eyes. Let me put these in water and then we can be on our way. She disappeared into the house, returning moments later without the flowers but carrying a wicker basket. Aunt's stable hand has saddled my mare, she said. She's waiting by the corral. They rode at an easy pace, Penelope leading the way to what she promised was a perfect picnic spot. The day was glorious, warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of pine and sage. There it is, Penelope said eventually, pointing ahead to where a small stream cut through a meadow dotted with late summer wildflowers. A copse of cottonwood trees provided dappled shade near the water's edge. What do you think? It's perfect, Yates agreed, genuinely impressed by the spot's natural beauty. They dismounted, tethering the horses where they could graze on the lush grass near the stream. Yates helped Penelope spread a blanket beneath the largest cottonwood, then watched as she unpacked the picnic basket. The meal was simple but delicious: cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and apple tarts for dessert. They ate companionably, their conversation flowing easily from topic to topic: books they'd read, places they'd seen, childhood memories. "What brought you to Wyoming?" Yates asked as they finished the last of the tarts. "You mentioned you're from Pennsylvania." Penelope brushed crumbs from her skirt, her expression turning thoughtful. "After my father passed away last year, I felt adrift. Mother had been gone for many years, and suddenly the house was so empty. When Aunt Alina invited me to spend the summer with her, it seemed like the perfect opportunity for a change of scenery." "I'm sorry about your father," Yates said sincerely. "Were you close?" "Very," she nodded. "He was a remarkable man. As a chaplain during the war, he saw the worst of humanity, yet never lost his faith in the best of it." She smiled slightly. "I think that's why I was so determined to help you. You reminded me of some of the men he described from the war, good men carrying burdens too heavy for anyone to bear alone." Yates was touched by the comparison. "He sounds like someone I would have respected greatly." "He would have liked you too," Penelope said with certainty. "He always said the measure of a man isn't whether he falls, but whether he gets back up again." They fell silent for a moment, the stream's gentle murmur filling the space between them. Yates found himself studying her profile as she gazed at the water, the delicate curve of her cheek, the determined set of her chin, the way the sunlight filtering through the leaves painted patterns of light and shadow on her fiery hair. "What are you thinking?" she asked, catching him watching her. "That I'm grateful," he answered honestly, "for this day, for you coming into my life when you did." He hesitated, then added, "For second chances." Penelope's expression softened. "Life is full of them if we're brave enough to take them, and are you," he asked, "brave enough?" Her eyes met his, steady and clear. "I'd like to think so." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, gathering his courage, Yates leaned forward and gently, almost reverently, kissed her. It was brief, a whisper of a kiss, really, but it changed everything. When he pulled back, Penelope's eyes remained closed for a heartbeat longer, her lips curved in a smile that made his heart race. "I've been wanting to do that since the harvest celebration," he admitted. "I've been hoping you would," she replied, her candor both surprising and delightful. They stayed by the stream for hours, talking, occasionally lapsing into comfortable silences, sharing another kiss or two, each one a little less hesitant than the last. The afternoon light was beginning to fade when they finally packed up the remains of their picnic and mounted their horses for the ride back to Rosehill. At the ranch, Yates helped Penelope down from her mare, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps longer than strictly necessary. They stood close together beside the stables, reluctant to end the day. "When can I see you again?" he asked, echoing her question from the harvest celebration. "I'll be in town on Tuesday," she replied. "Aunt has some business at the bank and I'm to pick up a few things from the general store." "I could meet you for lunch at the hotel restaurant," Yates suggested. "Say noon, I'd like that," Penelope agreed with a smile. Then, rising on tiptoe, she pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Until Tuesday, Yates." "Until Tuesday," he repeated, his hand rising unconsciously to touch the spot her lips had brushed. As he rode home that evening, the sunset painting the sky in spectacular hues of red and gold, Yates found himself doing something he hadn't done in a very long time. He prayed. Not formally, not with fancy words or biblical references. Just a simple expression of gratitude for the day, for Penelope, for the second chance he never expected and certainly hadn't earned. And somewhere in the vast Wyoming sky, he imagined Thomas smiling down at him, approving of this first tentative step back toward the light. Autumn painted the Wyoming landscape in vibrant hues of gold, amber, and russet. The mountains wore a dusting of early snow on their highest peaks, a harbinger of the winter to come. In St. George, preparations for the changing season were in full swing, hay being stored, cattle brought down from summer pastures, buildings weatherproofed against the coming cold. For Yates O'Malley, the past 2 months had been a time of transformation as profound as the seasonal changes around him. His courtship of Penelope Lawrence had progressed with a steadiness that surprised and delighted them both. Twice-weekly meetings had become near daily visits. Formal lunches in town had given way to comfortable evenings by the fire at Rosehill or at his own small ranch. The people of St. George watched with approval and no small amount of satisfaction as the once reclusive rancher rejoined the community, attending church regularly, participating in town meetings, even helping organize a harvest dance at the schoolhouse. Today, however, Yates's mind was occupied with more personal matters. As he put the finishing touches on his preparations, he could scarcely believe what he was about to do, yet it felt more right than anything had in years. He checked his pocket for the 20th time that morning, reassuring himself that the small velvet box was still there. Inside was his mother's ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond, nothing extravagant but filled with history and meaning. Yates had retrieved it from the bank vault where it had been stored since Emma's death. The decision to offer it to Penelope had not been made lightly. He'd spent a night in silent contemplation, asking himself if this was truly what he wanted, if he was ready to open his heart completely once again. The answer had come with the dawn, a certainty so profound that it left no room for doubt. He loved Penelope Lawrence, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. Now, as he saddled Copper for the ride to Rosehill, his stomach twisted with a combination of nervousness and anticipation. They'd planned a day-long ride to celebrate the beautiful autumn, whether a perfect opportunity for what he had in mind. Penelope was waiting for him on the porch when he arrived, a vision in a riding outfit of deep burgundy that complemented her hair and complexion perfectly. Her smile when she saw him still had the power to take his breath away. "You're early," she said as he dismounted. "Couldn't wait to see you," he replied honestly, taking her hand and raising it to his lips for a kiss. A blush colored her cheeks. After all this time, his gestures of affection still had that effect on her. It was one of the countless things he adored about her. "Aunt Alina has packed us enough food for a small army," Penelope said, nodding toward the saddlebags already secured to her mare. "I told her we'd be back before sunset, but she insists on being prepared." "Your aunt is a wise woman," Yates said with a smile, helping Penelope mount her horse, "and I'm grateful for her blessing on our outings." "She adores you," Penelope assured him, settling into her saddle. "I think she's been planning our wedding since the harvest celebration." The casual mention of a wedding sent a jolt through Yates. If all went as planned today, Mrs. Lawrence's planning might soon become more concrete. They rode at a leisurely pace, taking a trail that led up into the foothills east of St. George. The aspens were at their peak, their golden leaves shimmering in the sunlight. The air was crisp and clear, carrying the distinctive scent of autumn, a mixture of dry grass, pine, and the earthy aroma of fallen leaves. Their conversation flowed easily, as it always did now. Yates shared news from town. Penelope spoke of the letter she'd received from a friend back in Pennsylvania. They discussed books they'd both read, debated the merits of the new railroad spur being planned for the county, and playfully argued about whether apple or peach pie was superior. By midday, they'd reached Yates's planned destination, a small plateau overlooking the valley where St. George nestled like a toy town in the distance. A natural clearing surrounded by aspen trees offered the perfect spot for their picnic. "Oh, Yates," Penelope breathed as she took in the panoramic view. "It's magnificent. How did you find this place?" "Thomas and I discovered it years ago, hunting elk," Yates explained as he helped her dismount. "I've always thought it was one of the most beautiful spots in the territory, but I haven't been back in." "Well, a long time." Penelope squeezed his hand, understanding the significance of his bringing her here. "Thank you for sharing it with me." They spread a blanket beneath the largest aspen, whose golden leaves created a canopy of light above them. Yates built a small fire to ward off the autumn chill while Penelope unpacked the substantial lunch her aunt had provided. As they ate, Yates found his nervousness growing. He'd planned to wait until after lunch, perhaps during a walk along the plateau's edge, but now the small box in his pocket seemed to burn with urgency. "You're quiet," Penelope observed, studying his face with concern. "Is everything all right?" Yates set aside his plate, taking a deep breath. "Everything is more than all right. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." Penelope's expression grew curious. "Oh, Penelope," he began, then paused, gathering his thoughts. "When we met, I was lost, consumed by grief and anger, seeing no path forward. You changed that." She started to speak, but he gently raised a hand, asking for her patience. "Please let me finish. This isn't easy for me." He took another steadying breath. "You once told me that you'd pray for me when I couldn't pray for myself. What you did was far more than that. You showed me that life was still worth living. That joy was still possible, that love." His voice caught on the word. "That love could find me again, even when I'd given up on it entirely." Penelope's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she listened. "I know it hasn't been that long," Yates continued. "Some might say we're rushing, but when you've lived through what we both have, you learn that time is precious, and I don't want to waste another day not being completely yours." He reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small velvet box. Penelope's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing the ring nestled inside. "This was my mother's," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "My father gave it to her when they decided to come west together, to build a new life from nothing but hope and hard work. I can't think of anyone more deserving to wear it now." Sliding from the blanket to one knee before her, Yates held the ring out, his heart in his eyes. "Penelope Lawrence, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" For a moment, Penelope seemed too overcome to speak. Then, with tears spilling freely down her cheeks, she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Yates, with all my heart, yes." His hands trembling slightly, Yates slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. Penelope looked down at it, then back at him with such love that it nearly overwhelmed him. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You're beautiful," he replied, rising to sit beside her again. "Inside and out, I don't deserve you, but I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to." "Don't say that," she admonished gently, placing a hand against his cheek. "We deserve each other, we deserve this happiness." Then she leaned forward and kissed him, not the gentle, tentative kisses they'd shared before, but one filled with promise and passion and the certainty of a future together. When they finally parted, breathless and a little dazed, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. Penelope smiled. "Christmas is coming, wouldn't that be lovely? A Christmas wedding? Perfect," Yates agreed, his heart so full he could scarcely believe it. "Just like you." They lingered on the plateau until the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, talking of wedding plans, of where they would live, of the life they would build together. It was decided that they would make their home at Yates's ranch, which was smaller but solely his, while maintaining close ties to Rosehill. Mrs. Lawrence, who had no other family beyond Penelope, would be welcome to visit as often and for as long as she wished. As they rode back to Rosehill in the gathering dusk, Penelope's ring catching the last rays of sunlight, Yates found himself offering another silent prayer of gratitude, for second chances, for renewal. For the remarkable woman who had brought him back to life with her simple, profound offer. Then I'll do it for you. He didn't know what the future held. Life in Wyoming territory was never guaranteed to be easy or long, but whatever came, they would face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The wedding of Yates O'Malley and Penelope Lawrence was held on Christmas Eve, 1878, at the small church in St. George, Wyoming territory. Snow had fallen the night before, transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland that seemed crafted specifically for the occasion. The church was decorated with pine boughs, red ribbons, and candles that cast a warm, golden light over the proceedings. Every pew was filled not just with residents of St. George, but with people from surrounding ranches, and even a few who had traveled from as far as Cheyenne to witness the union of the once bitter cowboy and the compassionate young woman who had restored his faith. Sheriff Cooper served as Yates's best man, a role he accepted with gruff emotion that belied his usually stoic demeanor. Mrs. Lawrence, resplendent in a gown of deep blue velvet, gave away the bride in the absence of Penelope's father. Penelope herself was a vision in a dress of ivory satin, her red hair adorned with a crown of holly berries and small white flowers that Mrs. Peterson, the town's seamstress, had crafted especially for her. She carried a bouquet of pine and holly, with a single red rose at its center, a tribute to both the season and her namesake from Rose Hill Ranch. As Yates watched her walk down the aisle toward him, he was struck by a wave of emotion so powerful that he had to blink back tears. This woman, this angel, had saved him in every way a person could be saved. And now she was choosing to bind her life to his, to face whatever joys and sorrows the future might hold at his side. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Reverend Wilson spoke of new beginnings, of faith restored, of love's power to heal even the deepest wounds. When it came time for the vows, Yates and Penelope had chosen to speak their own words rather than repeat the traditional phrases. Penelope went first, her voice clear and steady despite the tears that shimmered in her eyes. Yates, when we first met, you told me you didn't pray. I said I would do it for you. Today, I make a larger promise to stand with you through all of life's joys and sorrows, to believe in you when you doubt yourself, to remind you of the good in the world when darkness threatens to overwhelm. I vow to be your partner, your confidante, your most steadfast supporter, and your truest friend. I give you my heart, freely and completely, now and always. Yates took a moment to compose himself before speaking, his voice rough with emotion. Penelope, I came to you broken, angry, lost in grief and bitterness. You didn't try to fix me, you simply showed me that I wasn't as broken as I thought. You offered compassion when I deserved condemnation. You saw something in me worth saving when I had given up on myself entirely. Today, I promise to spend the rest of my days proving worthy of that faith. I vow to protect you, to respect you, to listen to you, to grow with you, and to love you with every breath I take. You are my second chance, my miracle, my homecoming. And I will be grateful for you every day of our lives together. There wasn't a dry eye in the church as they exchanged rings. Penelope, now wearing both her engagement ring and a simple gold band that matched the one she placed on Yates's finger. By the authority vested in me, Reverend Wilson proclaimed, his own voice thick with emotion, and before God and this company I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no one put asunder. He smiled at Yates. You may kiss your bride. The kiss they shared was both tender and joyful, a promise, a celebration, a beginning. The wedding reception was held at the town hall, decorated as festively as the church with pine boughs, holly, and dozens of candles. A feast had been prepared by the women of St. George, each contributing their specialty dishes. A small band played, couples danced, and the atmosphere was one of genuine celebration. Mrs. O'Malley, Yates said with wonder as he and Penelope shared their first dance as husband and wife. I still can't quite believe it. Believe it, she replied with a radiant smile, her hand warm in his. I'm yours and you're mine, nothing will ever change that. Later, as the celebration continued around them, Sheriff Cooper approached with a telegram in hand. This came for you this morning, he told Yates. From Cheyenne. Thought it might be important, but didn't want to interrupt the ceremony. Curious, Yates opened the telegram. His expression changed as he read, a complicated mixture of emotions crossing his face. What is it? Penelope asked, concern in her voice. Yates handed her the telegram. It's from the warden at the territorial prison. Elijah Blackwell died yesterday. Pneumonia. Penelope read the brief message, then looked up at her husband, searching his face. How do you feel about this? Yates considered the question seriously, aware of Cooper watching him with equal interest. I'm not sure, he admitted finally. Sad in a way, he was a good man once before life broke him. He took the telegram back, folding it carefully. I hope he found some peace at the end. I'll pray that he did, Penelope said softly. Yates nodded, drawing her close. I know you will. And I think I will too. The simple statement meant more to both of them than any outside observer could understand. It represented the final step in Yates's journey back to faith, not just in God, but in humanity, in goodness, in the possibility of redemption. As the evening progressed, guests gradually departed, offering final congratulations and well wishes. By the time Yates and Penelope left the town hall, the streets of St. George were quiet, blanketed in snow that glittered under a full moon and star-filled sky. A sleigh waited to take them to Yates's ranch, their home now, the horses adorned with bells that jingled merrily as they set off. Wrapped in warm blankets, nestled close together, the newlyweds watched the winter landscape pass in comfortable silence. Happy. Yates asked eventually, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple. Completely, Penelope assured him, leaning into his embrace. And you, more than I ever thought possible, he replied honestly. More than I deserve. There you go again, she chided gently. When will you accept that you deserve every happiness? That we both do, Yates smiled, tightening his arm around her. I'm working on it. With your help, I think I might get there eventually. We have a lifetime, Penelope reminded him, her eyes reflecting the starlight as she looked up at him with love. And I intend to use every day of it to remind you of how much good there is in the world, in you. As the sleigh carried them toward home and their future together, Yates found himself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought him to this moment of perfect contentment. From the depths of grief and rage to the heights of love and joy, with Penelope as his guide and companion through it all. I love you, he said simply, the words still new enough to feel miraculous on his lips. And I love you, she replied, sealing the declaration with a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. Epilogue. 5 years later, the summer sun beat down on the Wyoming plains, bringing the scent of wildflowers and sage on the warm breeze. From the porch of the O'Malley ranch house, considerably expanded from its bachelor days, Yates watched as Penelope walked slowly through the vegetable garden, their 3-year-old son Matthew toddling along beside her, chattering endlessly about the butterflies dancing among the plants. Cradled in Yates's arms was their newest addition, 1-month-old Rebecca, named for Penelope's mother. She slept peacefully, tiny fingers curled against her father's shirt, completely trusting in his protection. The past 5 years had transformed the O'Malley ranch almost beyond recognition. The small cabin had given way to a proper house, with a spacious kitchen, comfortable parlor, and bedrooms enough for their growing family. Barns and corrals had been expanded, the cattle herd had tripled in size, and a small orchard of apple trees, Penelope's special project, was beginning to bear fruit. But the physical changes paled in comparison to the transformation in Yates himself. The bitter, grief-stricken man who had once sworn off prayer now led his family in giving thanks before every meal. The recluse who had shut himself away from human connection now served as a deacon in the church and on the town council. The cowboy who had lost his faith had found it again in God, in community, in family, and most of all in the remarkable woman who had promised to pray for him when he could not pray for himself. Penelope glanced up from the garden, catching Yates watching her. The smile she gave him was as bright and warm as the day they'd met, untarnished by the years and challenges they'd faced together. If anything, their love had only deepened with time and shared experience. "Papa," Matthew called, having spotted him on the porch. "Look what I found." He held up what appeared to be a particularly large grasshopper, his expression one of pure delight. "That's quite a discovery, son," Yates called back, careful not to wake the sleeping Rebecca. "Why don't you show it to your mother?" Penelope's theatrical shriek of surprise sent Matthew into gales of laughter, the sound carrying across the yard like music. Watching them, Yates felt the familiar swell of gratitude that was now as much a part of him as breathing. Every day, he thanked God for his family, for the second chance he'd been given, for the prayers that had been answered even when he hadn't been the one to offer them. "Then I'll do it for you." 5 simple words that had changed everything. As if sensing his thoughts, Penelope looked up at him again, love written plainly on her face. Then she took Matthew's hand and led him toward the porch, toward home. Toward the future they continued to build together, prayer by prayer, day by day, blessing by blessing. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd once thought he'd never have, Yates O'Malley knew with absolute certainty that he was, at long last, truly redeemed.